Hello, class, and welcome to Mr. Brandis' fifth and final podcast on evolution. In this podcast, we're going to talk about how new species come about, including the different types of selection. We're also going to review sympatric and allopatric speciation. And at the end, we're also going to talk about the different types of prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. So it should be noted that a new creature can come about through the mechanisms of microevolution, and through natural selection, we can generate a new species. However, because the changes within the populations are minor, there needs to be other barriers in order to separate closely related species. So a brief review of allopatric and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is when populations of the same species are geographically separated, and therefore their gene pools are also separated. So it's the creation of a new species in different geographic locations. Sympatric speciation is when new species arise from within the same geographic area as the parent species. So it's new species coming about within the same population. So there are three types of selection. There's stabilizing selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. As we can see at the very top, we have our original population of mice with their varying phenotypes. Here we see light-colored mice, and then intermediately colored mice, and then the darker colored mice. And depending on the type of area in which they live, they will have different types of selection. Directional or stabilizing selection favors intermediate phenotypes, acting against the extreme phenotypes. Directional selection acts against individuals at one of the phenotypic extremes. Disruptive selection favors individuals at both extremes of the phenotypic range. And this selection specifically occurs in a patchy habitat. What I mean by that is habitats with varying vegetation and geographic location. So in Swiss starlings, clutch size varies from 1 to 8. The average clutch size is 4. Researchers marked chicks from different clutch sizes and recaptured fledglings after 3 months. Fledglings are young birds. Birds from clutches with 3, 4, or 5 birds had higher recapture rates than birds from clutches of 1 or 2 or 6 or 7 or 8. And so what type of selection would cause this? Well, if you guessed stabilizing selection, you are correct. Don't forget, stabilizing selection selects for those individuals that are the intermediates. And because birds with clutches 3, 4, or 5 are around the average clutch, between 1 and 8, and they are the intermediates. And so as you can see, they would be stabilizing selection. Artificial selection is another type of selection, and it's one that's very important to human race. And it's when selective breeding of domesticated plants and animals are used to produce offspring with desired genetic traits. So believe it or not, things like kohlrabi, cabbage, kale, broccoli, and cauliflower all actually came from an original ancestor of the wild mustard seed. And as we can see on the bottom right-hand corner is another good example of corn. Corn used to be a very small grass that just had a few kernels on their ends. And as you can see, over many years, individuals have noticed that when you breed a large ear of corn with another large ear of corn, you get a larger ear of corn. And so we've been selectively breeding these animals, and that type of selective breeding is called artificial selection. Same thing is true with dogs and cats and most of the other house pets as well. Sexual selection is when individuals pick and choose who they mate with, and usually the stronger or the more beautiful, and therefore also most healthy individuals reproduce. And so in many animal species, males and females look different from one another. And this is called sexual dimorphism. It means males look different than the females. Intrasexual competition involves the competition for mates, and it's usually put on by males. So you can think of that as deer fighting for their mate, or peacocks trying to strut their stuff in front of the female and in order to attract them to get to mate with them, or even peepers based on their call. Females will choose to mate with that individual that has the best sound. I want you to keep in mind that the separation of a small splinter population from its main population is a crucial event in the origin of species. Once separate, the splinter population may follow its own evolutionary course, and a splinter population is basically the transition between micro and macro evolution. It's when a population becomes different enough to really start diverging from its original lineage. So recall that genetic drift, a change in the gene pool due to chance, plays a key role in microevolution, and changes in allele frequencies caused by genetic drift and natural selection can accumulate in the splinter population, making it less and less like the main population that it came from. And for each isolated population that becomes a new species, many more are simply extinct, which means they perish. That population does not exist anymore. Sometimes these isolated populations, these splinter populations, although they are separated, they can still make contact or remake contact. In this case, we call these hybrid zones, which are members of different species that meet and mate to produce hybrid offspring. So if we take a look at this diagram here, we can see that we have an ancestral species indicated by the number 1. And as that ancestral species begins to divide into a splinter population, which is represented by 2, due to some sort of barrier to the gene flow between those ancestral species, and they begin to become different as time goes on, time's going from left to right. And because there's no gene flow for an extended period of time, we can see that these become slightly different. If species A and species B were able to meet, some of those might actually be able to reproduce with one another. And so this hybrid zone can have several consequences. So there are 3 types of consequences to the creation of this hybridization zone, in which you can have reinforcement, fusion, or stability. Reinforcement is if the hybrids are less fit than the parent species. Natural selection strengthens the reproductive barriers. Fusion occurs when weak reproductive barriers between the 2 species exist, in addition to considerable gene flow. And finally, reverses speciation and 2 species become one again. Stability is when many hybrid zones are stable, continuing to reproduce hybrids, and this allows some gene flow between the populations, but each species maintains its own integrity. So what are some of these reproductive barriers? First off, a reproductive barrier is something that will keep those 2 species from interbreeding, a condition known as reproductive isolation. The inability to breed marks species as separate. If so, what keeps existing species that are similar and closely related from interbreeding? Well, an example of this could be the spotted skunk and the eastern spotted skunk. They are so similar that only other spotted skunks and expert biologists can tell them apart. Where the skunks' range overlap in the Great Plains region, individuals from these 2 species don't actually mate. And we're going to go through some of the reasons why those individuals cannot mate. So a reproductive barrier is just that. It's a barrier that will cause the inability to reproduce with one another. Types of reproductive barriers between species. We actually have 2 major types. We have prezygotic and post-zygotic. Pre-zygotic is defined as a barrier that occurs before a zygote is formed. And post-zygotic barriers are barriers that occur after the zygote has formed. Don't forget, a zygote is a fertilized egg and is the start of a creature. So some pre-zygotic barriers include timing, behavior, habitat, mechanical, and gametic. Pre-zygotic barriers in terms of timing: when two similar species have different breeding seasons, the skunks fit this category. So if one species differs in breeding season than the other, then neither of them will be able to reproduce with one another because they'll be reproducing at separate times. So the skunks fit this category. The western spotted skunk breeds in the fall when the eastern species breeds in the late winter. So the timing of their breeding seasons keeps them apart. Behavior is another type of pre-zygotic barrier, and it's when two similar species may have different courtship or mating behaviors. So the western and eastern meadowlarks actually are very much identical in many ways, except for their mating calls. And because they have different mating calls, those creatures are kept apart from breeding with one another. Another type of pre-zygotic barrier is habitat. This type of pre-zygotic barrier occurs when some species maintain reproductively isolated because they are adapted to different habitats in the same general location. For example, a certain lake in Columbia, Canada, contains two different species of three-spined stickleback fish. One species is adapted to living along the lake bottom, feeding on small snails, and the other species spends most of their lives living in the open water, filtering phytoplankton or small floating organisms. Gametic isolation is another type of pre-zygotic barrier, and it's when two similar species may be unable to mate because their reproductive structures are physiologically incapable of reproducing with that other individual. As in the case of some plants, the insects or other animals that transfer flower pollen may do so only among plants of a single species. This is called gametic isolation. So, post-zygotic barriers. In some cases, no barriers exist between members of different species. In these cases, the zygote formed is called a hybrid. However, even after the hybrid zygote forms, reproduction may still not be successful. When that reproduction is successful, living hybrids are usually themselves unable to reproduce. The production of the hybrids is quite costly, and the energy from mating and producing offspring has still been spent by the parents, with no future inheritance of their genetic material in return. So to go over all of these, we have, for pre-zygotic barriers, we have temporal isolation, habitat isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and gametic isolation. So interestingly enough, many plant species have evolved by polyploidy, and the polyploidy basically means that the multiplication of the chromosome number due to errors in cell division. So we talked about how non-disjunction can occur in humans in order to create conditions like trisomy 21. Same things can occur in nature, especially in plants. It happens quite often. And a tetraploid is symbolized by 4n instead of 2n like we are at the very beginning of meiosis. Plants can actually be 4n and can arise from a diploid parent. So in this case, individuals have taken wheat and cross-pollinated them with one another to form a sterile hybrid, which has 14 chromosomes. So once this individual starts undergoing meiosis, if there is self-fertilization and an error in cell division, you can end up with too many genes. You could actually end up with 28. So 14 times 2 is 28. This individual, if bred with another individual of the normal wild type, in which it has 14 chromosomes, can create a sterile hybrid again with 21 chromosomes. And if a cell divisional error occurs, then we can have 42 chromosome plant actually alive and well. But don't forget, you have to find a divisional error that will give you homologous chromosomes. So as long as you have homologous chromosomes pairing up, you will be able to have that individual reproduce and produce fertile offspring. And in fact, 80% of our living plant species are descendants of ancestors that formed by polyploid speciation. Hybridization between two species accounts for actually most of these species. Polyploid food plants include oats, potatoes, bananas, peanuts, barley, plums, apples, sugarcane, coffee, and cotton, as well as wheat. Adaptive radiation is evolution from a common ancestor of many species that have adapted to diverse environments. Adaptive radiation can also be caused by new opportunities, such as the lack of competitors, varying habitats and food sources, as well as the evolution of new structures. And again, don't forget, that's when a variety of creatures all stem from one common ancestor. And so, as I stated before with the founder effect, one individual can come across to an isolated spot and spread throughout those islands, and can also create other individuals from that original common ancestor. So where A came over and transformed into B, B can also transform into C, which can transform into D, and so on and so forth. Even D owes its lineage to A. And finally, punctuated equilibrium is an evolutionary model suggesting that species often diverge in spurts of relatively rapid change, followed by periods of little change. So, given a model of gradual adaptation through natural selection, how could species have sudden bursts of change? Well, speciation can sometimes be quite rapid. In just a few hundred to a few thousand generations, genetic drift and natural selection can actually cause a significant change in a small population that is occupying a challenging new environment. And so that's how you can get these really big changes followed by periods of no change whatsoever. So the gradual model of adaptation shows one creature turning into a slightly different one, which turns into a slightly different one, and so on and so forth, in very small increments that occur quite often. The other type is the punctuated equilibrium model, which shows great change in quick bursts, followed by periods of no change whatsoever. We can use these models and these cladograms and these lineages to create a phylogenetic tree, which you guys know as the tree of life. And we can come about with a phylogenetic species concept, similar to our biological species concept. And the phylogenetic species concept defines a species as a set of organisms representing a specific evolutionary lineage. And so we can trace those all the way back to the original common ancestor, as stated in adaptive radiation. So that's all. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed these series of podcasts. Again, if you have any questions or you are concerned about something, please write that down and share it with the class tomorrow. I also hope that you rewatch this and take some notes on it to better understand it, and we'll discuss this in class tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.